Hey guys, tonight we begin with perhaps one of history's most misunderstood intimate traditions. What actually happened on wedding nights during China's Tang Dynasty? And trust me, it was nothing like what Hollywood has taught you to expect. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into the night's journey together into the bedchambers of medieval China, where romance met ritual in the most unexpected ways. Let's start with the biggest misconception about Tang Dynasty wedding nights. Most people imagine some sort of passionate romantic encounter between two lovers finally united in marriage. In reality, these wedding nights were elaborate theatrical performances involving extended families, complex rituals, and sometimes complete strangers meeting for the very first time. Think of it less like a modern honeymoon and more like a bizarre combination of a religious ceremony, a business transaction, and a medical examination, all happening in the same bedroom. This wasn't some fairy tale romance where two hearts became one. It was a carefully orchestrated social event where two families merged their fortunes, bloodlines, and political connections, with the bride and groom often serving as somewhat reluctant performers in a drama written entirely by their elders. The Tang Dynasty, spanning from 618 to 907 CE, was China's golden age of culture and prosperity. But Chang'an, the Tang capital, wasn't some romantic paradise of courtly love. It was a bustling metropolis of over 1 million people where marriages served as the backbone of economic and social stability. The imperial court, wealthy merchant families, and Confucian scholars controlled not just who married whom, but exactly how these unions were consummated, down to the precise timing and positioning required for optimal spiritual harmony. If you thought Tang Dynasty China was all poetry and silk robes, think again. It was a society obsessed with cosmic balance, ancestral approval, and producing male heirs as quickly as possible. Marriage wasn't about personal happiness. It was about maintaining the delicate balance between heaven, earth, and humanity. The wedding night represented the moment when two family lineages officially merged, when ancestral spirits could finally rest easy knowing their bloodline would continue, and when complex financial arrangements, often negotiated for months or even years, were finally sealed through physical union. The pressure on newlyweds wasn't just social or familial. It was literally cosmic. According to Tang beliefs, an improperly conducted wedding night could throw off the balance of key energy for generations, potentially cursing entire family lines, with infertility, financial ruin, or political disgrace. Every gesture, every word, every moment of timing had been calculated by fortune tellers, family elders, and sometimes even imperial advisors to ensure maximum cosmic harmony. Take Princess Gaoyang, Emperor Taizong's beloved daughter, whose wedding night in 641 CE became legendary for all the wrong reasons. Princess Gaoyang was known for her intelligence, beauty, and unfortunately for her family, her complete disdain for traditional wedding protocols. Her marriage to Fang Ya, son of the famous minister Fang Juanling, was supposed to be a perfect union of political power and scholarly prestige. But Princess Gaoyang had other ideas. According to court records, she spent her wedding night not in the mere submission to ritual requirements, but interrogating her new husband about his political opinions, challenging his poetry, and reportedly refusing to participate in the traditional harmony ceremony until he could best her in a game of xiangqi, Chinese chess. The wedding guests, including several high-ranking court officials, waited outside the bridal chamber for hours, growing increasingly nervous as sounds of animated debate rather than romantic murmurs emerged from within by dawn, when the couple was supposed to emerge with proof of their successful union. Princess Gaoyang had apparently converted her intended wedding night into something resembling a philosophical salon. She had invited several of the younger wedding guests into the bridal chamber to discuss poetry and politics, completely abandoning any pretense of following traditional consummation protocols. The scandal rippled through Chang'an society for months. Traditional families whispered about cosmic imbalance and ancestral displeasure, while more progressive court circles quietly celebrated her boldness. And if you think that's shocking, wait until you hear about the elaborate preparation rituals that most Tang brides had to endure for weeks before their wedding nights, including dietary restrictions that would make modern wellness influencers seem relaxed by comparison. This wasn't just about two people getting married and having an intimate moment together. Tang Dynasty wedding nights represented the intersection of family honor, economic survival, spiritual balance, and political alliance building all compressed into a single evening that could determine the fate of entire family lineages for generations to come. For brides, often teenagers who had never spoken privately with their grooms before the wedding day, these nights represented their transformation from daughters to wives, from protected family members to the primary bearers of responsibility for producing male heirs. For grooms, the wedding night was their first test of worthiness as family patriarchs, with their performance being scrutinized not just by their new wives, but by extended family members, fortune tellers, and sometimes even government officials who have financial interests in the union's success. The complexity and contradictions we'll explore reveal a society struggling between ancient traditions and evolving social realities, between individual desires and collective expectations, between the intimate and the institutional. These weren't private moments. They were public performances with audience members, scorekeepers, and sometimes even official witnesses whose job was to ensure everything proceeded according to ancient protocols. But Princess Gaoyang's rebellious wedding night was just the beginning of a much larger story about how Tang Dynasty society tried to control, regulate, and optimize one of humanity's most personal experiences. The preparation rituals alone would make modern wedding planning seem like child's play. The preparation rituals for Tang Dynasty wedding nights weren't just about getting ready for romance. They were elaborate purification ceremonies that could last for weeks and involved everyone from imperial physicians to neighborhood fortune tellers. Unlike modern wedding planning where couples focus on venues and flowers, Tang Dynasty families obsessed over cosmic timing, dietary purification, and what can only be described as medieval performance coaching for the bride and groom. These weren't simple beauty treatments or nervous butterflies before the big day. Tang wedding preparation was a complex system designed to align human sexuality with cosmic forces, ensure fertility through spiritual cleansing, and prepare both parties for what was essentially a ritualized performance that would be evaluated by multiple generations of family members. The process involved strict dietary regimens, herbal treatments that modern medicine would consider dangerous, meditation practices, and detailed instruction in everything from proper breathing techniques to the exact words that should be spoken during intimate moments. What makes this particularly fascinating is how these preparations revealed Tang society's deep anxiety about the intersection of the physical and spiritual worlds. Wedding nights weren't just about producing heirs. They were about maintaining the cosmic balance that kept the entire empire stable. A poorly prepared bride could theoretically throw off the key energy of her husband's entire family line, while an inadequately purified groom might fail to properly honor his ancestors through successful procreation. The preparation rituals also served as a kind of social insurance policy. In a society where divorce was nearly impossible and marriages were permanent regardless of personal compatibility, these elaborate pre-wedding procedures were designed to maximize the chances of physical and spiritual harmony between complete. strangers who would spend the rest of their lives together. The rituals were simultaneously practical and mystical, combining genuine medical knowledge about fertility and health with elaborate spiritual beliefs about cosmic harmony and ancestral approval. Take the case of Lady Wei, a merchant's daughter, whose 678 CE wedding preparation became legendary throughout Chang'an for its extremity and ultimate irony. Lady Wei's family, newly wealthy from silk trading, was determined to ensure their daughter's marriage to a minor court official would be cosmically perfect. They hired Master Liu, one of the capital's most expensive wedding preparation specialists, who designed a 6-week purification regimen that bordered on the absurd. Lady Wei's preparation began with a complete astrological analysis of both her and her intended groom's birth charts, followed by consultations with 3 different fortune tellers to determine the most auspicious timing for every aspect of their union. She was then placed on a strict diet consisting primarily of white foods, rice, milk, certain mushrooms, and specially prepared white fish, because white was associated with purity and new beginnings. For 3 weeks, she consumed nothing but these colorless foods, supplemented by herbal teas that were supposed to brighten her inner ki, but apparently left her constantly nauseous. The physical preparations were equally elaborate. Lady Wei underwent daily massage treatments with oils infused with peony petals, jasmine, and ground pearls, ingredients that cost more than most families earned in a year. These weren't relaxing spa treatments. They were systematic attempts to optimize her skin texture, hair shine, and even her natural scent for maximum appeal to both her husband and the ancestral spirits, who would supposedly be observing their wedding night. Master Liu also required Lady Wei to practice specific meditation techniques designed to enhance her receptive yin energy, while simultaneously learning what can only be described as medieval Kama Sutra techniques from a specialized instructor known as a harmony teacher. These sessions involved learning precise physical positions, memorizing romantic poetry to recite at specific moments, and practicing breathing exercises that were supposed to help synchronize her ki with her husband's during intimate moments. Meanwhile, her groom was undergoing his own preparation ritual, which included consuming tiger bone powder to enhance his assertive yang energy, practicing calligraphy to steady his nerves, and receiving detailed instruction in the proper sequence of romantic gestures, compliments, and physical approaches he should employ. He was also required to abstain from alcohol, meat, and even conversation with other women for 2 weeks before the wedding to ensure his spiritual purity. The irony of Lady Wei's story emerged on her actual wedding night. After 6 weeks of intensive preparation, cosmic alignment calculations, and enormous financial investment, she and her groom were both so nervous and overwhelmed by the pressure to perform according to their detailed instructions that they spent most of their wedding night sitting on opposite sides of their bridal chamber, comparing notes about their respective preparation experiences and laughing about the absurdity of trying to be spontaneously romantic according to a predetermined script. According to family records that survived in private collections, Lady Wei and her husband eventually developed a loving relationship, but it took months for them to overcome the artificial awkwardness created by their overly elaborate preparation process. Their first child wasn't born until nearly 2 years after their marriage, leading to widespread speculation about whether Master Liu's expensive cosmic alignment calculations had actually disrupted their natural harmony rather than enhancing it. But it wasn't that simple. While Lady Wei's experience suggests that over-preparation could backfire, other Tang Dynasty sources reveal that completely unprepared brides often faced even worse outcomes. The contradiction at the heart of Tang wedding preparation was that society simultaneously demanded spontaneous romantic connection and carefully orchestrated ritual performance, 2 requirements that were obviously incompatible. Consider the case of rural families, who couldn't afford elaborate preparation specialists. Their brides often entered marriage with no knowledge of what to expect, leading to wedding nights that were traumatic rather than harmonious. Without proper preparation, these young women had no framework for understanding their role in the complex social and spiritual drama they were expected to perform. The result was often years of marital discord, failure to produce children, and family shame that could persist for generations. On the other hand, excessive preparation created its own problems. Wealthy families sometimes became so obsessed with cosmic perfection that they lost sight of the human elements that actually made marriages successful. Some preparation rituals were so elaborate and time-consuming that brides and grooms became exhausted before their wedding nights even began. Others involved such restrictive dietary and behavioral requirements that the participants' health suffered, potentially affecting their fertility, the very outcome the preparations were designed to optimize. The most significant contradiction was between individual agency and social control. Tang Dynasty wedding preparations were ostensibly designed to help brides and grooms succeed in their new roles. But the elaborate requirements often left participants feeling like actors in someone else's play rather than autonomous individuals, beginning their own life journey. Many surviving personal accounts describe feeling disconnected from their own wedding experience, as if they were watching themselves perform roles that had been scripted by previous generations. There was also a gender contradiction embedded in these preparation rituals. While both brides and grooms underwent purification and instruction, the requirements for women were significantly more restrictive and invasive. Brides were expected to transform themselves completely, physically, spiritually, and behaviorally, while grooms were primarily required to maintain their existing masculine energy while adding some romantic polish. This double standard reflected broader Tang Dynasty attitudes about women's roles in marriage, but it also created practical problems. When brides felt they had sacrificed their individual identity for cosmic harmony while their husbands remained essentially unchanged, the result was a complex ecosystem of wedding preparation industries, family expectations, and social pressures that shaped Tang Dynasty marriage culture for centuries. Professional preparation specialists like Master Liu became wealthy and influential, creating a guild system that standardized wedding rituals across different social classes, while simultaneously making them more expensive and elaborate. Families competed to provide the most thorough preparation for their children, leading to an escalating arms race of ritual complexity that consumed enormous resources and created significant social pressure. Wedding preparation became a way for families to display their wealth, cultural sophistication, and spiritual devotion, but it also became a source of debt and anxiety for those who couldn't afford the most elaborate procedures. The institutional response was equally complex. The imperial court occasionally issued edicts trying to limit the most extreme preparation practices, particularly those that involved dangerous herbal treatments or excessive financial expenditure. However, these government interventions were largely ineffective because wedding preparations were deeply embedded in religious beliefs and family traditions that preceded imperial authority. Local communities developed their own responses to preparation pressure. Some regions created cooperative systems where families shared the costs of hiring preparation specialists, while others developed simplified ritual versions that maintained spiritual significance while reducing financial burden. Buddhist and Taoist temples began offering wedding blessing services that provided spiritual legitimacy without requiring expensive private consultations. The most significant long-term consequence was the evolution of Tang Dynasty marriage culture toward greater ritual sophistication but decreased personal autonomy. As preparation requirements became more elaborate and standardized, individual couples had less opportunity to develop their own approaches to intimacy and partnership. This created a generation of marriages that were cosmically aligned but personally distant, spiritually pure but emotionally disconnected. Women's reactions to these preparation requirements varied dramatically. Some embraced the rituals as empowering spiritual practices that prepared them for their important role as family matriarchs. Others resented the physical restrictions and loss of personal autonomy. A few, like Princess Gaoyang, openly rebelled against the entire system, creating scandals that rippled through court society, but also inspired other women to question traditional expectations. Men's responses were generally more positive, probably because their preparation requirements were less restrictive and invasive. However, some grooms complained that the elaborate ritual requirements created artificial pressure and made it difficult to develop genuine emotional connections with their wives. The expectation that they should perform according to predetermined scripts while simultaneously being spontaneously romantic created psychological stress that sometimes persisted throughout their marriages. Meanwhile, the physical spaces where these carefully prepared couples would consummate their marriages were undergoing their own elaborate transformation. Tang Dynasty bridal chambers weren't just bedrooms. They were sacred spaces designed according to feng shui principles, decorated with symbolic objects, and arranged to maximize both romantic appeal and spiritual harmony. The preparation of these wedding night venues involved nearly as much planning and expense as the preparation of the bride and groom themselves. Families hired specialists to design room layouts that would encourage fertility, prosperity, and marital harmony. Every piece of furniture, every decorative object, every color choice was made according to ancient principles that supposedly influenced the cosmic energy of intimate encounters. But the reality of what happened in these perfectly prepared spaces often diverged dramatically from the ideal scenarios that families had spent months planning and enormous sums creating. The contrast between the elaborate environmental preparation and the actual human experience of wedding nights reveals another layer of Tang Dynasty society's complex relationship with intimacy, tradition, and social control. These bridal chamber preparations also became a way for families to communicate their values, aspirations, and expectations to the new couple without directly intervening in their private moments. The room itself became a silent instructor, guiding behavior through environmental cues while maintaining the fiction that the couple's intimate experience was private and spontaneous. If Tang Dynasty bride and groom preparation was elaborate theater, then the bridal chambers themselves were nothing less than sacred temples, designed to channel cosmic forces directly into human sexuality. These weren't just beautifully decorated bedrooms. They were carefully engineered, spiritual environments where every piece of furniture, every color choice, and every decorative object was positioned according to ancient feng shui principles that supposedly determined whether the marriage would produce sons, wealth, happiness, or generational curses. The science of bridal chamber preparation became so sophisticated during the Tang Dynasty that specialized feng shui masters charged enormous fees to design these intimate spaces. Unlike modern interior decorating, where personal taste drives decisions, Tang bridal chambers were arranged according to complex calculations involving the couple's birth dates, the alignment of celestial bodies, the flow of key energy through the building, and even the specific sexual positions that would be most cosmically favorable for conception. What makes this particularly fascinating is how these room preparations revealed Tang society's belief that the physical environment could directly influence spiritual and biological outcomes. A bed positioned incorrectly could theoretically prevent pregnancy. The wrong color scheme might invite malevolent spirits. Improper placement of mirrors could deflect positive energy away from the couple and toward their rivals or enemies. These bridal chamber feng shui requirements weren't optional suggestions. They were considered essential insurance policies against marital failure, infertility, and cosmic imbalance. Wealthy families spent fortunes importing specific materials, hiring master craftsmen, and even rebuilding entire sections of their houses to ensure optimal energy flow for their children's wedding nights. The pressure to get every detail perfect was enormous because mistakes weren't just aesthetic problems. They were potential spiritual disasters that could affect multiple generations. The complexity of these environmental preparations also reflected Tang Dynasty society's sophisticated understanding of psychology, even though they described it in spiritual rather than scientific terms. They recognized that physical surroundings influenced mood, confidence, and behavior, but they attributed these effects to cosmic forces rather than human psychology. The result was room designs that were often genuinely conducive to romance and intimacy, but for reasons their creators didn't fully understand. Consider the legendary bridal chamber of Yang Gaifei, one of Tang Dynasty China's most famous beauties, whose 745 CE marriage preparations became the gold standard for aristocratic wedding luxury. Yang Gaifei's bridal chamber wasn't just a room. It was an entire pavilion constructed specifically for her wedding night, designed by Master Chun, the imperial court's most celebrated feng shui specialist. Master Chun spent 3 months calculating the optimal orientation for the bridal pavilion based on Yang Gaifei's birth chart, her intended husband's astrological profile, and the specific date chosen for their wedding. The pavilion was positioned to capture morning sunlight from the east, while protecting against evening shadows from the west, supposedly ensuring that the couple's yang energy would be maximized during their most fertile hours while their yin energy remained balanced during periods of rest. The interior design was even more elaborate. The bed itself was crafted from sandalwood, imported from Southeast Asia, and positioned exactly 7 feet from the eastern wall to optimize key flow. The frame was inlaid with jade dragons and phoenixes, symbols of masculine and feminine cosmic forces, arranged in patterns that supposedly encouraged harmony between opposing energies. The mattress was stuffed with silk cocoons, chrysanthemum petals, and ground pearls, creating a surface that was both luxurious and spiritually purifying. Every piece of furniture was selected and positioned according to specific feng shui principles. 2 matching chairs faced each other across a small table where the couple would share tea and poetry before retiring, symbolizing intellectual as well as physical union. A bronze mirror was placed on the southern wall to reflect positive energy back into the room while deflecting negative influences. Fresh peonies, flowers associated with honor and wealth, were arranged in specific geometric patterns that supposedly created optimal energy circulation. The color scheme was equally calculated. The dominant red symbolized passion and good fortune, but it was balanced with gold accents representing prosperity and white silk details symbolizing purity. Even the lighting was feng shui optimized. Dozens of specially positioned candles created patterns of light and shadow designed to enhance both romantic mood and spiritual energy flow. But perhaps the most remarkable element was the harmony altar, a small shrine built into the eastern corner of the room where ancestral tablets, fertility symbols, and offerings of wine and fruit were arranged to invite positive spiritual intervention in the couple's intimate life. This wasn't decoration. It was a functional religious installation designed to ensure that the couple's physical union would receive cosmic approval and ancestral blessing. The results, according to court records, were mixed at best. Yang Gaifei's wedding night was reportedly beautiful and romantic, but her marriage eventually became notorious for political complications and personal drama that had nothing to do with feng shui optimization. Despite the perfectly designed bridal chamber, she failed to produce the male heirs that were supposed to be guaranteed by the elaborate environmental preparations. An even more dramatic example comes from the merchant family of Li Baoshan, whose 689 CE wedding chamber preparations became a cautionary tale about feng shui extremism. Li Baoshan's father, desperate to ensure his son's marriage would produce prosperity and numerous grandsons, hired 3 different feng shui masters who provided conflicting advice about optimal room design. The first master insisted the bed should face north to honor ancestors. The second demanded east-facing orientation for maximum yang energy. The third argued for west-facing placement to encourage evening fertility. Rather than choose between them, Li Baoshan's father decided to incorporate all 3 recommendations. By constructing a rotating bed mechanism that could be repositioned throughout the night according to different cosmic requirements. The result was an engineering nightmare that dominated the bridal chamber and created constant mechanical noise throughout the wedding night. The couple spent most of their time trying to operate the complex bed rotation system rather than focusing on romantic connection. According to family records, the mechanical difficulties were so distracting that consummation was delayed for several days while servants attempted to repair the malfunctioning rotation mechanism. The Li family's experience became legendary throughout Chang'an as an example of how excessive feng shui optimization could backfire spectacularly. Their story was retold for generations as a warning against allowing spiritual perfectionism to override practical common sense, though it didn't significantly reduce demand for elaborate bridal chamber preparations among other wealthy families. This wasn't isolated. Across Tang Dynasty China, wealthy families engaged in increasingly elaborate competition to create the most spiritually optimized bridal chambers, leading to a pattern of escalating complexity that often defeated its own purpose. The more families spent on feng shui perfection, the more pressure they created for successful outcomes, which ironically made genuine romantic connection more difficult to achieve. The pattern of feng shui extremism reveals several consistent themes in Tang Dynasty marriage culture. First, there was a widespread belief that spiritual preparation could guarantee practical outcomes. The proper cosmic alignment would automatically produce fertility, prosperity, and marital happiness regardless of personal compatibility or individual circumstances. This magical thinking led families to invest enormous resources in environmental manipulation, while often neglecting the human elements that actually determine marriage success. Second, these elaborate preparations reflect a deep anxiety about cosmic forces and spiritual balance that permeated Tang Dynasty society. Wedding night feng shui wasn't just about interior decorating. It was about managing existential fears regarding fate, divine approval, and generational continuity. Families used bridal chamber design as a way to feel they had some control over cosmic forces that otherwise seemed random and unpredictable. Third, the feng shui industry that developed around wedding preparations created its own momentum and commercial interests. Master practitioners had financial incentives to recommend increasingly complex and expensive solutions, leading to an arms race of spiritual sophistication that pushed far beyond what was practically necessary or even beneficial for the couples involved. Regional variations in these practices reveal how local traditions modified universal feng shui principles. Northern Chinese families emphasized different cosmic elements than southern families, leading to bridal chamber designs that reflected regional spiritual preferences as well as climate considerations. Mountain communities developed feng shui practices adapted to their geographical environment, while river valley families incorporated water element symbolism that was less relevant in desert regions. The pattern also shows how gender roles were embedded in environmental design. Bridal chambers were primarily designed to optimize female fertility and receptivity, with male comfort and preferences receiving secondary consideration. Room layouts, color schemes, and furniture arrangements were calculated to enhance feminine yin energy while providing supportive but subordinate space for masculine yang energy. This reflected broader Tang Dynasty assumptions about women's primary responsibility for reproductive success. Most significantly, the pattern of elaborate bridal chamber preparation reveals how Tang Dynasty society used environmental control as a substitute for direct communication about sexuality and intimacy. Rather than providing couples with practical education about physical compatibility and emotional connection, families invested in creating perfect spiritual environments that were supposed to automatically generate optimal romantic outcomes. The rooms themselves became silent instructors, communicating expectations and values through symbolic design rather than explicit conversation. The effects were profound and lasting, reshaping Tang Dynasty domestic architecture and establishing design principles that influenced Chinese interior decoration for centuries. Wealthy families began constructing their homes with specialized bridal chambers that could be adapted for different feng shui requirements, leading to architectural innovations that balanced spiritual optimization with practical functionality. Who benefited most clearly were the feng shui masters and craftsmen, who created a lucrative industry around wedding chamber design. These specialists commanded enormous fees and gained significant social influence as families competed to hire the most celebrated practitioners. The best feng shui masters became wealthy enough to establish schools and train programs, institutionalizing their knowledge and ensuring continued demand for their services across multiple generations. The furniture and decorating industries also prospered enormously. Specialized craftsmen developed expertise in creating beds, mirrors, lighting fixtures, and decorative objects designed specifically for bridal chamber feng shui requirements. Import businesses flourished as families demanded exotic materials. Sandalwood from Southeast Asia, jade from Central Asia, pearls from the South China Sea that were believed to enhance cosmic energy flow. Who suffered were often the couples themselves, particularly brides who found their most intimate moments shaped by environmental requirements they hadn't chosen and didn't understand. Many women reported feeling like guests in their own bridal chambers, surrounded by objects and arrangements that reflected their families' spiritual beliefs rather than their personal preferences or comfort needs. The financial burden of elaborate bridal chamber preparation also created significant hardship for middle-class families who felt pressured to compete with aristocratic standards they couldn't afford. Many families went into debt to provide feng shui-optimized wedding environments, leading to long-term financial stress that ironically undermined the prosperity that the spiritual preparations were supposed to guarantee. Unintended consequences included the development of a black market in fake feng shui objects and fraudulent spiritual consultations. Less scrupulous practitioners exploited anxious families by selling expensive but spiritually meaningless decorative items, leading to widespread skepticism about authentic feng shui principles among educated Tang Dynasty intellectuals. The emphasis on environmental perfection also created unrealistic expectations about wedding night experiences. Couples who had been promised cosmic harmony through optimal room design often felt disappointed when their actual intimate experiences didn't match the spiritual ideals their families had invested so heavily in creating. This gap between feng shui promises and practical reality led to marital dissatisfaction that persisted long after the wedding night itself. Perhaps most significantly, the focus on bridal chamber feng shui established a pattern of using material objects and environmental manipulation to address spiritual and emotional needs. This approach influenced Tang Dynasty culture far beyond wedding preparations, contributing to a broader tendency to seek cosmic solutions to human problems through physical arrangement rather than direct communication and personal development. Yet, even as families obsessed over creating perfectly balanced spiritual environments for their children's wedding nights, The actual human drama that unfolded in these carefully designed spaces often bore little resemblance to the cosmic harmony that feng shui masters had promised. The contrast between environmental perfection and emotional reality created its own set of tensions and surprises. The most dramatic moments in Tang Dynasty wedding night history weren't the result of optimal feng shui alignment or spiritual preparation. They were the product of individual personalities colliding with social expectations in ways that no amount of cosmic planning could predict or control. When young people who had never spoken privately before their wedding day were suddenly expected to perform intimate romance according to predetermined scripts in perfectly optimized environments, the results were often more theatrical than romantic. These peak moments of wedding night drama revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Tang Dynasty marriage culture. The assumption that cosmic forces and social institutions could engineer spontaneous human connection. The stories that emerged from these perfectly prepared bridal chambers often read more like comedy than romance, as nervous couples struggled to balance spiritual requirements with physical reality, while extended family members waited outside for evidence of successful consummation. The pressure to perform perfectly in perfect environments created its own kind of crisis that would define Tang Dynasty wedding culture and influence Chinese marriage traditions for centuries to come. By the height of the Tang Dynasty, in the early 8th century, the elaborate system of wedding night preparations, feng shui optimization, and cosmic alignment had reached a breaking point. The pressure on young couples to perform perfect romance according to predetermined scripts in spiritually engineered environments had created a generation of wedding nights that were more like theatrical auditions than intimate encounters. The stakes had become so impossibly high that failure wasn't just personal disappointment, it was cosmic catastrophe that could allegedly curse entire family lineages. The crisis centered around the fundamental contradiction between spontaneous human emotion and carefully orchestrated spiritual performance. Couples were expected to experience immediate romantic connection while simultaneously following complex ritual requirements, achieving cosmic harmony while navigating the mechanics of intimacy with complete strangers, and satisfying both ancestral spirits and extended family expectations within the span of a single evening. The psychological pressure was enormous, and the cultural investment in successful outcomes had reached levels that made failure almost inevitable. Key players in this brewing crisis included the imperial court, which had become concerned about declining birth rates among aristocratic families despite increasingly elaborate wedding preparations. Wealthy merchant families who were bankrupting, themselves trying to compete with royal wedding standards. Confucian scholars who questioned whether excessive ritual complexity was undermining the natural harmony that marriage was supposed to represent. And most importantly, the young couples themselves who found their most intimate moments choreographed by people they had never met according to principles they didn't understand. The stakes involved weren't just individual happiness or family honor. They had expanded to include economic stability, political alliances, and spiritual balance for the entire empire. Wedding night failures were increasingly interpreted as signs of cosmic displeasure that could affect everything from agricultural harvests to military campaigns. What had begun as personal ceremonies had evolved into events with perceived national significance, creating pressure that no human relationship could realistically bear. The crisis reached its dramatic peak during the wedding of Crown Prince Li Chongrun and Princess Consort Wei in 701 CE, an event that became legendary throughout the Tang Dynasty for completely demolishing the myth that perfect preparation could guarantee perfect outcomes. This wasn't just any wedding. It was a carefully orchestrated political alliance designed to strengthen the imperial family's connection with powerful military generals. And every detail had been planned for over a year by teams of the empires most celebrated specialists. The preparation had been absolutely flawless. Master Feng, the imperial court's chief feng shui advisor, had spent months calculating the optimal timing, room arrangement, and spiritual preparations. The bridal chamber had been constructed according to the most sophisticated cosmic principles ever attempted, incorporating elements from Taoist, Buddhist, and ancient shamanic traditions. The Crown Prince had undergone 6 months of physical and spiritual preparation, including dietary purification, meditation training, and detailed instruction in romantic techniques from the empire's most experienced harmony teachers. Princess Consort Wei had been even more extensively prepared. She had been selected for her perfect astrological compatibility with the Crown Prince, trained in classical poetry and music to enhance the romantic atmosphere, and subjected to elaborate purification rituals that had cost the imperial treasury more than some military campaigns. Her wedding dress alone incorporated silk from 12 different provinces, pearls from the South China Sea, and jade ornaments that had been blessed by Buddhist monks, Taoist priests, and Confucian scholars. The wedding ceremony itself had proceeded flawlessly. Thousands of guests had witnessed the perfect execution of ancient rituals, the exchange of cosmically significant gifts, and elaborate performances by the empire's finest musicians and dancers. The astrological timing had been calculated to the minute, and every spiritual requirement had been fulfilled with unprecedented precision. As the newlyweds retired to their perfectly prepared bridal chamber, courtiers whispered that this union would surely produce the ideal heirs that the Tang Dynasty needed to ensure its continued prosperity. But then, reality intervened in the most spectacular way possible. According to court records that were carefully suppressed for decades, the Crown Prince and Princess Consort Wei discovered that they literally could not stand each other's company. Despite their perfect astrological compatibility, months of preparation, and the most sophisticated romantic coaching available, they found each other's personalities completely incompatible. The Crown Prince, who had been described as scholarly and contemplative, was actually arrogant and condescending. The Princess Consort, selected for her supposed gentleness and refinement, turned out to be sharp-tongued and impatient with what she perceived as her husband's intellectual pretensions. Their wedding night began with an argument about poetry. The Crown Prince attempted to recite the romantic verses he had memorized during his preparation, but Princess Consort Wei interrupted to correct his pronunciation and criticize his interpretation of classical allusions. This led to a heated literary debate that escalated into personal insults and eventually into a shouting match that could be heard throughout the imperial palace. By midnight, servants were reporting that sounds of breaking pottery were emerging from the bridal chamber, suggesting that the cosmic harmony everyone had invested so heavily in creating had devolved into something resembling a domestic riot. The situation became even more absurd when the couple's assigned harmony advisor, Master Song, attempted to intervene by entering the bridal chamber to provide real-time coaching in romantic reconciliation. Instead of calming the situation, his presence only intensified the conflict as both the Crown Prince and Princess Consort Wei turned their anger toward him, blaming his preparation methods for their mutual disappointment. Master Song found himself trapped in a room with two furious young people who were throwing silk pillows at each other while debating whether Confucian or Taoist principles provided better guidance for marital harmony. The crisis reached its peak when Princess Consort Wei declared that she would rather become a Buddhist nun than spend another moment pretending to experience cosmic romance with someone she found insufferable. The Crown Prince responded by threatening to exile her to a remote province where she could practice her literary criticism on goat herders instead of imperial heirs. By dawn, when the couple was supposed to emerge from their bridal chamber with evidence of successful consummation and cosmic alignment, They were instead sitting on opposite sides of the room, glaring at each other while Master Song desperately attempted to mediate their conflict using every romantic reconciliation technique known to Tang Dynasty relationship specialists. The response was unprecedented panic throughout the imperial court and beyond. The emperor himself, upon learning that his carefully orchestrated political alliance had devolved into mutual hatred despite perfect spiritual preparation, reportedly locked himself in his private chambers for 3 days to contemplate what this failure meant for the cosmic balance of his empire. If the most elaborate wedding preparations in Tang Dynasty history couldn't produce even basic compatibility between astrologically matched partners, then the entire system of arranged marriage and spiritual optimization was fundamentally flawed. Immediate consequences rippled throughout Chang'an society within hours. Feng Shui masters who had guaranteed cosmic harmony through proper environmental preparation found their reputations shattered and their services suddenly unwanted. Families who had invested fortunes in elaborate wedding preparations began questioning whether their money had been wasted on spiritual theater rather than practical relationship building. The harmony teacher industry, which had flourished by promising to coach couples toward romantic success, faced a crisis of confidence as their methods were revealed to be powerless against genuine personality incompatibility. Political fallout was equally severe. The military alliance that the crown prince's marriage was supposed to cement became a source of embarrassment rather than strength, as Princess Consort Wei's family felt humiliated by their daughter's public rejection of imperial romantic standards. Court officials who had invested their own reputations in the success of this perfect wedding found themselves struggling to explain how cosmic forces could be so dramatically misaligned. Despite flawless human preparation, the broader social consequences were transformative. Middle-class families who had been bankrupting themselves to replicate aristocratic wedding standards suddenly felt justified in questioning whether elaborate preparations were worth the financial sacrifice. Young people who had been dreading their own arranged marriages felt emboldened to express concerns about compatibility that had previously been dismissed as irrelevant to cosmic harmony. Religious communities responded with intense theological debate about whether the failure represented divine displeasure with excessive materialism in wedding preparations, or proof that human free will was more powerful than cosmic determinism. Buddhist monasteries reported increased interest from young women seeking alternatives to arranged marriage, while Taoist temples experienced growing demand for relationship counseling services that emphasized natural harmony over engineered perfection. The economic impact was immediate and substantial. The wedding preparation industry, which had employed thousands of specialists and craftsmen, contracted rapidly as demand for elaborate feng shui optimization declined. Import businesses that had prospered selling exotic materials for bridal chamber decoration found their markets collapsing as families shifted toward simpler, more practical wedding arrangements. Most significantly, the Crown Prince and Princess Consort Wei's spectacular failure created the first serious public discussion about whether compatibility and personal affection might be more important for successful marriages than astrological alignment and spiritual preparation. This was a revolutionary concept that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between cosmic forces and human happiness. This dramatic wedding night failure wasn't just embarrassing palace gossip. It represented the collapse of centuries-old assumptions about the ancestral relationship between spiritual preparation and human compatibility. The incident revealed that Tang Dynasty society had become so focused on cosmic optimization that it had lost sight of the basic psychological and emotional factors that actually determined whether marriages succeeded or failed. What it revealed about the system was profoundly unsettling for Tang Dynasty elites. The elaborate infrastructure of feng shui masters, harmony teachers, astrological consultants, and spiritual advisors had created an expensive illusion of control over romantic outcomes, while actually making genuine connection more difficult to achieve. The pressure to perform according to predetermined scripts had transformed wedding nights from opportunities for couples to discover each other into theatrical events where success was measured by adherence to spiritual protocols rather than mutual satisfaction or emotional bonding. Long-term effects included a gradual shift away from the most extreme forms of wedding preparation toward more balanced approaches that considered individual personality and preference alongside cosmic harmony. However, this transformation was slow and uneven, with conservative families continuing to invest heavily in elaborate preparations, while more progressive households began experimenting with simplified rituals that emphasized practical compatibility over spiritual perfection. The incident also established precedent for questioning imperial wedding standards and created space for alternative approaches to marriage that had previously been considered spiritually dangerous or socially unacceptable. Young people who had witnessed the spectacular failure of perfect preparation began advocating for opportunities to meet and evaluate their potential spouses before wedding day, a radical concept that gradually gained acceptance among educated families. Why historians still debate it relates to larger questions about the relationship between individual agency and social control in traditional Chinese society. Some scholars argue that the crown prince and princess consort Wei's rebellion represented early signs of the individualistic thinking that would eventually transform Chinese marriage culture. Others contend that their failures simply revealed the need for better preparation methods rather than fundamental problems with arranged marriage systems. The debate continues because this single wedding night encapsulated the central tension between tradition and personal autonomy that shaped Tang Dynasty society and continues to influence Chinese culture today. Whether cosmic harmony or individual compatibility should take precedence in marriage remains a question that each generation must answer for itself. Around the main drama of Tang Dynasty wedding nights, a fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles in shaping how these intimate moments unfolded. Master Wang, the matchmaker, was perhaps the most influential figure in Chang'an's marriage industry, a shrewd businessman who claimed he could guarantee romantic compatibility through astrological analysis, but actually made his matches based on careful observation of personality, types, and family dynamics. Unlike his competitors who relied purely on birth charts and cosmic calculations, Master Wang spent months secretly observing potential couples in social situations, learning their preferences, temperaments, and hidden anxieties before making recommendations that had an unusually high success rate. Master Wang's story reveals the gap between public mysticism and private pragmatism that characterized much of Tang Dynasty marriage culture. While he publicly promoted his services using elaborate astrological terminology and cosmic harmony theories, his private notebooks, discovered centuries later, revealed detailed psychological profiles of his clients written in remarkably modern language. He understood that successful marriages required emotional compatibility, shared interests, and complementary personalities, but he marketed this knowledge using spiritual concepts that his clients found more acceptable than direct discussion of human psychology. Madame Liu, the harmony teacher, represented another crucial figure in this ecosystem, a former palace concubine who had parlayed her intimate knowledge of male psychology into a lucrative career coaching nervous brides in romantic techniques. Madame Liu's approach was refreshingly practical compared to most wedding preparation specialists. Instead of focusing on cosmic energy alignment, she taught women how to read their husband's moods, how to use conversation and humor to diffuse tension, and how to gradually build emotional intimacy over time rather than expecting instant romantic connection on wedding night. Her story illustrates the underground network of women who provided practical relationship advice while officially promoting spiritual harmony doctrines. Madame Liu's students often became informal mentors for other young wives, creating a chain of practical knowledge that operated parallel to the official system of feng shui masters and astrological consultants. She understood that wedding nights were just the beginning of lifelong relationships that required ongoing emotional work, not one-time cosmic optimization. Dr. Jiang, the imperial physician, brought a different perspective entirely to Tang Dynasty wedding culture. Trained in traditional Chinese medicine, but influenced by medical texts from India and Central Asia, Dr. Jiang understood that many wedding night problems stemmed from basic health issues, nutritional deficiencies, and anxiety disorders that spiritual preparation couldn't address. He quietly treated couples for physical problems that made intimacy difficult while publicly supporting the fiction that cosmic harmony was the primary factor in marital success. Dr. Jiang's confidential medical records revealed the enormous gap between spiritual theory and biological reality in Tang Dynasty marriage culture. Many couples who were considered spiritually incompatible were actually suffering from treatable medical conditions that affected their energy levels, mood stability, and physical comfort. His discreet treatments often succeeded where elaborate feng shui preparations had failed, but social taboos prevented him from publicly challenging the spiritual interpretation of marital problems. These weren't isolated incidents operating in separate spheres. The stories of Tang Dynasty wedding night culture reveal complex webs of relationships and mutual dependencies that shaped how the entire system functioned. Master Wang, the matchmaker, often worked closely with Madame Liu, the harmony teacher, referring couples who needed practical relationship coaching, while she recommended his services to families seeking more compatible matches than random astrological pairings could provide. Their collaboration reveals how pragmatic professionals found ways to work within the official spiritual system while actually providing evidence-based relationship services. Master Wang would identify couples with genuine compatibility potential, then refer the brides to Madame Liu for practical coaching in managing the emotional realities of arranged marriage. This unofficial partnership created better outcomes than either purely astrological matching or purely spiritual preparation could achieve alone. The connection between Dr. Jiang and these relationship specialists was even more complex. He often provided medical treatments that enhanced the effectiveness of Madame Liu's relationship coaching, treating anxiety disorders that made romantic connection difficult, addressing nutritional deficiencies that affected energy and mood, and providing discreet contraceptive advice that allowed couples to build emotional intimacy before facing the pressure of immediate pregnancy. These medical interventions were essential to the success of more practical approaches to marriage preparation, but they had to remain completely hidden from families who believed that spiritual purity was more important than physical health. Political networks also shaped these interconnected stories. Master Wang's matchmaking success brought him to the attention of court officials who wanted to arrange marriages that would strengthen political alliances. However, his emphasis on personality compatibility sometimes conflicted with families' desires for economically or politically advantageous matches. He learned to navigate these competing pressures by finding ways to present compatibility-based recommendations using language that emphasized cosmic harmony and ancestral approval rather than individual preference. The economic relationships between these various specialists created another layer of interconnection. Feng Shui masters who designed bridal chambers often collaborated with harmony teachers who would coach couples in how to use the spiritually optimized spaces effectively. Dr. Jiang provided medical clearances that enhanced the credibility of spiritual preparations while treating health problems that could undermine expensive feng shui investments. One particularly revealing case involved the marriage of merchant Li Desheng's daughter in 695 CE, which required coordination between all these different specialists. Master Wang had identified a compatible match based on personality observation, but the families insisted on additional astrological verification from competing feng shui masters. Madame Liu was hired to prepare the bride, but her practical coaching conflicted with the spiritual preparation requirements mandated by the feng shui consultants. Dr. Zhang was called in to address the bride's anxiety about conflicting preparation advice, but his medical recommendations contradicted some of the dietary purification requirements. The result was a complex negotiation between different professional approaches that revealed both the strengths and limitations of Tang Dynasty wedding culture. Each specialist had valuable expertise, but the lack of coordination between spiritual, practical, and medical approaches often created contradictory advice that confused couples and undermined everyone's effectiveness. The most successful outcomes occurred when these professionals found ways to collaborate quietly, while maintaining their distinct public roles within the official spiritual framework. To understand how these various specialists operated within Tang Dynasty wedding culture, you have to understand the broader social environment that shaped their work. Daily life for most Tang Dynasty families revolved around extended kinship networks where individual privacy was almost non-existent and personal decisions were considered family matters that required collective input and approval. Wedding nights were intimate moments between two people. They were family events with multiple stakeholders who had economic, political, and spiritual investments in successful outcomes. Beliefs and attitudes about sexuality reflected this collective approach to personal relationships. Physical intimacy was understood primarily as a mechanism for producing heirs and maintaining cosmic balance, rather than as an expression of individual emotional connection. This meant that wedding night success was measured by outcomes that extended far beyond the couple's personal satisfaction. Fertility, family harmony, economic prosperity, and spiritual alignment were all considered direct results of proper intimate conduct. Social structures reinforced these attitudes through elaborate systems of mutual surveillance and collective responsibility. Extended family members, household servants, and community elders all had recognized roles in monitoring and advising couples about their intimate relationships. Privacy as we understand it simply didn't exist, which meant that wedding night problems quickly became community issues, requiring group problem-solving efforts. What was considered normal versus exceptional reveals the enormous pressure that couples faced to conform to idealized standards that few real relationships could actually meet. Normal wedding nights were expected to produce immediate romantic connection, spiritual harmony, and ideally conception within the first few encounters. Anything less than this ideal outcome was considered exceptional and potentially problematic, requiring intervention from various specialists to diagnose and correct whatever spiritual or practical failures had occurred. The cultural emphasis on perfectionism created a psychological environment where couples were afraid to admit difficulties or ask for help with normal relationship challenges. This silence perpetuated unrealistic expectations and prevented the development of more practical approaches to marriage that might have better served individual couples' actual needs. Religious and philosophical frameworks provided the language and conceptual structure within which all these relationship dynamics were understood and discussed. Confucian emphasis on family harmony, Taoist concepts of cosmic balance, and Buddhist ideas about spiritual purification all contributed to a complex worldview that saw intimate relationships as having cosmic significance, far beyond personal happiness or individual fulfillment. Perhaps most ironic was how Tang Dynasty society's obsession with spiritual perfection in wedding nights actually made genuine spiritual connection more difficult to achieve. The elaborate preparations, cosmic calculations, and performance pressure created artificial barriers to the natural emotional intimacy that most spiritual traditions actually considered essential for meaningful human relationships. Couples who were supposed to experience transcendent union through perfectly optimized encounters often found themselves too nervous and distracted by ritual requirements to achieve any kind of authentic connection. Another profound contradiction existed between the public emphasis on cosmic harmony and the private reality that the most successful marriages often resulted from ignoring official spiritual guidance in favor of practical relationship skills. Couples who learn to communicate effectively, show mutual consideration, and gradually build emotional trust typically develop stronger marriages than those who focus primarily on achieving optimal feng shui alignment or following elaborate romantic scripts. The gender contradictions were equally revealing. While official doctrine emphasized the importance of balancing masculine and feminine cosmic energies, the actual preparation and guidance systems were heavily weighted toward optimizing female behavior while treating male preferences and comfort as secondary considerations. Women were expected to transform themselves completely to achieve cosmic harmony, while men were primarily required to maintain their existing masculine energy with minimal modification. Perhaps the most striking contradiction was between the enormous resources invested in wedding night optimization and the actual factors that determined long-term marital success. Families spent fortunes on single evening preparations while providing minimal support for the ongoing communication skills, conflict resolution abilities, and emotional intelligence that actually sustained relationships over decades. The irony extended to the professional specialists themselves, many of whom privately understood that their official methods were less effective than the practical psychology and medical interventions they provided discreetly. The most successful harmony teachers, matchmakers, and even feng shui masters were those who found ways to address real human needs, while maintaining the fiction that cosmic forces were the primary determinants of relationship outcomes. Modern parallels to these contradictions can be seen in contemporary cultures that invest heavily in wedding ceremonies while providing minimal preparation for the actual work of building successful marriages, or in societies that emphasize romantic idealism while struggling to teach practical relationship skills that help couples navigate the ordinary challenges of long-term partnership. Everything changed when Emperor Xuanzang issued the Edict on Natural Harmony in Marriage in 712 CE, a revolutionary decree that fundamentally challenged centuries of elaborate wedding night preparation by suggesting that cosmic forces might actually prefer simplicity over complexity. This wasn't just a minor policy adjustment. It represented the imperial court's first official acknowledgement that the increasingly elaborate system of feng shui optimization, spiritual preparation, and cosmic alignment might be counterproductive to the very outcomes it was designed to achieve. The background to this dramatic shift reveals how multiple failures and contradictions had finally reached a tipping point that even the imperial court could no longer ignore. The Crown Prince's spectacular wedding disaster 3 years earlier had been followed by a series of similar, high-profile marriage failures among aristocratic families who had invested enormous resources in perfect spiritual preparation only to achieve disastrous practical outcomes. Birth rates among the wealthy classes were actually declining despite increasingly sophisticated fertility optimization rituals, while divorce rates, technically illegal but practically achieved through various legal maneuvers, were rising. Among families that had spent the most on elaborate wedding preparations, why this moment was different from previous concerns about wedding culture excess relates to several converging factors that created unprecedented pressure for reform. First, the economic burden of competitive wedding preparation had become so extreme that it was affecting the imperial treasury, as wealthy families bankrupted themselves, trying to achieve impossible standards of cosmic perfection. Second, military. Recruitment was suffering because young men from prominent families were avoiding marriage entirely rather than face the psychological pressure of performing according to elaborate spiritual scripts. Third, Buddhist and Taoist religious leaders had begun questioning whether the commercialization of spiritual principles in wedding culture was actually hindering rather than helping authentic spiritual development. The key factors that led to this transformation included growing influence from Central Asian and Indian philosophical traditions that emphasized individual spiritual development over collective ritual performance. Tang Dynasty China's cosmopolitan culture had exposed educated elites to alternative approaches to marriage and spirituality that challenged traditional Chinese assumptions about the relationship between cosmic forces and human happiness. Trade. Connections with cultures that practiced arranged marriage without elaborate spiritual preparation provided concrete examples of how simpler approaches could achieve successful outcomes. Emperor Xuanzong himself had personal reasons for questioning traditional wedding culture. His own marriage had been arranged according to the most sophisticated astrological calculations available, but his relationship with Empress Wang had been notably unhappy despite perfect cosmic alignment. Meanwhile, his unofficial relationship with Yang Gaifei, conducted without any spiritual preparation or cosmic optimization, had been genuinely fulfilling and emotionally satisfying. This personal experience convinced him that authentic human connection might be more important than elaborate ritual preparation. The edict represented a careful political balance between revolutionary change and traditional respect for ancestral wisdom. Rather than completely rejecting feng shui principles or spiritual preparation, it reframed these practices as supportive rather than essential elements of successful marriage. The key phrase, natural harmony, suggested that cosmic forces actually preferred organic development of relationships over engineered perfection, providing theological cover for practical reforms while maintaining respect for traditional spiritual concepts. The transformation of Tang Dynasty wedding culture didn't happen overnight. It unfolded through a complex process of resistance, adaptation, and gradual acceptance that took nearly 2 decades to fully implement. The initial resistance to Emperor Xuanzong's reforms came primarily from the feng shui industry and traditional families who had invested their social status in mastering elaborate wedding preparation rituals. These established interests fought the changes not just because of economic concerns, but because simplified wedding practices threatened their cultural authority and spiritual expertise. Feng shui masters responded to the imperial edict by arguing that natural harmony actually required even more sophisticated cosmic calculations to determine what approaches would be most natural for specific couples. This creative reinterpretation allowed them to maintain their professional relevance while appearing to support imperial reforms. Some specialists pivoted toward offering simplified complexity services that claimed to achieve optimal cosmic alignment through more elegant and refined methods rather than elaborate preparations. Champions of change emerged from unexpected quarters, including some of the most prestigious families who had previously been leaders in wedding preparation excess. The Duke of Wei's family became early adopters of simplified wedding practices after their daughter's marriage succeeded spectacularly despite minimal spiritual preparation, while neighboring families, who had invested heavily in elaborate preparations, continued to experience disappointing outcomes. These high-profile success stories provided powerful social proof that simpler approaches could actually deliver better results. The specific steps of transformation began with gradual reductions in the most extreme preparation requirements. Families started shortening the lengthy dietary purification periods, simplifying bridal chamber feng shui arrangements and reducing the number of specialists involved in wedding planning. Instead of eliminating spiritual elements entirely, they focused on what reformers called essential harmony practices, basic elements that were considered spiritually necessary without the elaborate additions that had accumulated over previous centuries. Obstacles encountered during this transition period included significant social pressure from conservative families who viewed simplified wedding practices as signs of spiritual laziness or disrespect for ancestral traditions. Young couples who wanted to adopt simplified approaches often faced intense family resistance, leading to intergenerational conflicts that sometimes delayed marriages for years while families negotiated acceptable compromises between traditional requirements and reformed practices. Breakthrough moments occurred when several prominent matches arranged using simplified methods produced notably successful marriages and healthy children, while comparable families using traditional elaborate preparations continued to experience problems. The most influential breakthrough came when Princess Taiping, Emperor Xuanzong's sister, publicly adopted simplified wedding practices for her daughter's marriage in 715 CE. The success of this high-profile simplified wedding provided imperial family endorsement for reform approaches and gave other aristocratic families permission to reduce their own preparation requirements. The role of individuals versus larger historical forces in driving this transformation reveals the complex interplay between personal leadership and social momentum that characterizes major cultural changes. While Emperor Xuanzong's personal authority was essential for initiating reforms, the actual transformation required thousands of individual families making daily decisions to prioritize practical relationship outcomes over traditional spiritual requirements. Master Wang, the matchmaker, played a crucial role in this transition by documenting the superior success rates of couples who focused on compatibility over cosmic alignment. His careful records provided empirical evidence that reformed approaches actually achieved better spiritual outcomes than traditional methods, giving families concrete data to support their decisions to adopt simplified practices. Madame Liu, the Bediu harmony teacher, adapted her services to emphasize ongoing relationship skills rather than single-event preparation, helping couples develop communication and emotional intimacy abilities that sustain marriages over decades rather than just optimizing wedding night experiences. Her expanded approach influenced other relationship specialists to shift from event-focused services toward long-term relationship support. The broader transformation also reflected changing economic realities as Tang Dynasty China's expanding trade networks created new wealth that wasn't tied to traditional agricultural land ownership. Merchant families had different values and priorities than hereditary aristocrats, and they were more willing to experiment with practical approaches to marriage that emphasized economic partnership and mutual benefit over cosmic harmony and ancestral approval. Religious communities contributed to the transformation by developing theological frameworks that supported simplified wedding practices as more authentically spiritual than elaborate preparations. Buddhist teachers argued that excessive focus on material preparation and cosmic manipulation distracted couples from the genuine spiritual work of developing compassion and mutual understanding. Taoist philosophers contended that natural harmony emerged from simplicity rather than complexity, providing spiritual authority for practical reforms. The new Tang Dynasty wedding culture that emerged from these reforms was dramatically different from the elaborate system that had preceded it. Simplified wedding nights typically involved basic spiritual acknowledgments, lighting incense for ancestors, sharing tea while discussing their hopes for marriage, and arranging their bedroom according to fundamental feng shui principles. But without the complex cosmic calculations, expensive specialist consultations, and elaborate preparation rituals that had previously dominated wedding culture. How things were different became apparent in both practical and psychological dimensions. Couples reported feeling more relaxed and authentic during their wedding nights, when they weren't required to perform according to detailed spiritual scripts or demonstrate mastery of complex romantic techniques they had memorized during preparation training. The reduced pressure allowed for more genuine emotional connection and gradual development of intimacy over time rather than demanding immediate cosmic harmony during a single evening. Who won and who lost from these reforms reveals the complex social dynamics of cultural transformation. Young couples were clear winners, as they gained greater autonomy in developing their relationships according to their individual personalities and preferences, rather than predetermined spiritual requirements. Middle-class families also benefited significantly from reduced financial pressure, as simplified wedding practices cost a fraction of what elaborate preparations had required. Traditional feng shui masters and harmony teachers initially lost significant income and social influence, but many successfully adapted by pivoting toward ongoing relationship counseling and simplified spiritual guidance rather than intensive pre-wedding preparation. Those who embraced change maintained their professional relevance, while specialists who insisted on traditional elaborate methods found their client base gradually shrinking. The new rules and norms emphasize gradual relationship development over immediate perfection, practical compatibility over astrological alignment, and ongoing spiritual growth over single-event cosmic optimization. Couples were encouraged to view their wedding night as the beginning of a long-term spiritual and emotional journey rather than a performance that would determine their cosmic destiny. Aristocratic families initially resisted these changes, but gradually recognized that simplified approaches actually produce more stable marriages and healthier family dynamics. The most successful noble families were those who found ways to maintain their social status while adopting practical relationship approaches that prioritize genuine compatibility and mutual respect. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically illustrates how cultural transformation often preserves core values while modifying the methods used to achieve them. The fundamental goals of Tang Dynasty marriage culture, producing healthy heirs, maintaining family harmony, and achieving spiritual balance, remained unchanged. But the methods for pursuing these goals shifted from elaborate external preparation toward ongoing internal development. Spiritual elements weren't eliminated, but were reframed as supportive rather than controlling factors in relationship success. Basic feng shui principles continued to influence bedroom arrangement, but without the extreme complexity that had previously characterized bridal chamber design. Ancestral acknowledgement remained important, but through simple offerings and prayers, rather than elaborate ritual performances. The economic impact was substantial and generally positive for most families. Reduced wedding preparation costs allowed families to invest in other priorities like education, business development, and long-term household establishment, rather than concentrating enormous resources on single evening events. This economic reallocation contributed to broader Tang Dynasty prosperity, as family wealth was directed toward productive rather than ceremonial purposes. The psychological transformation was equally significant. Young people began approaching marriage with optimism rather than anxiety, viewing their wedding nights as opportunities for discovery and connection rather than tests of their ability to perform according to predetermined spiritual requirements. This attitudinal shift contributed to improved marriage satisfaction and family stability that persisted throughout the later Tang Dynasty period. Was this change positive? The evidence suggests it was overwhelmingly beneficial for Tang Dynasty society, though different groups experienced the transformation differently, and some valuable elements of traditional culture were inevitably lost during the transition. From the perspective of individual couples, Simplified wedding practices clearly produced better outcomes than elaborate traditional preparations. Marriage satisfaction increased, divorce rates declined, and birth rates among reformed families actually improved despite reduced spiritual optimization efforts. Different perspectives on the reforms reveal how cultural change creates both winners and losers, even when the overall impact is positive. Conservative families mourned the loss of spiritual sophistication and cultural refinement that elaborate wedding preparations had represented, arguing that simplified practices reflected declining respect for ancestral wisdom and cosmic harmony. Progressive families celebrated the increased individual autonomy and practical focus that reforms provided, contending that authentic spirituality emerged from genuine relationship development rather than external ritual performance. Short-term versus long-term effects show how cultural transformations often produce immediate disruption followed by eventual stabilization at a new equilibrium. The short-term effects included social confusion, intergenerational conflict, and economic disruption for traditional wedding preparation industries. However, long-term effects were predominantly positive, including improved marriage stability, reduced family financial stress, and more authentic spiritual development within relationships. Unintended consequences included some loss of cultural knowledge about traditional feng shui principles and spiritual practices that had genuine value beyond their application to wedding preparation. Some families overcorrected toward excessive simplification, eliminating spiritual elements that could have enriched their marriage experience without creating the problems associated with elaborate traditional approaches. Modern judgment versus contemporary views reveals how historical perspective influences evaluation of cultural changes. Contemporary Tang Dynasty observers were often divided about whether reforms represented spiritual progress or cultural decline, depending on their personal experiences and social position. Modern historians generally view the reforms as successful adaptation to changing social and economic conditions, though some scholars argue that certain valuable traditional elements could have been preserved while still achieving practical improvements. The most balanced assessment recognizes that Emperor Xuanzang's wedding culture reforms successfully addressed real problems with traditional practices, while preserving core spiritual and social values that gave meaning to marriage. Relationships. The transformation demonstrated how societies can evolve their cultural practices in response to changing conditions without abandoning fundamental principles about family, spirituality, and human connection. In the years and decades that followed Emperor Xuanzang's wedding culture reforms, Tang Dynasty society discovered that simplifying wedding preparations had created entirely new challenges that no one had anticipated. While the elimination of elaborate cosmic optimization had successfully reduced financial pressure and performance anxiety, it had also removed a structured guidance system that had helped nervous couples navigate their first intimate encounters. However, imperfectly. By the 730s, a generation of young people who had grown up expecting simplified wedding nights found themselves longing for more guidance and ritual structure than the reformed system provided. The evolution of the situation revealed how cultural pendulum swings often overcorrect before finding a sustainable middle ground. Many families had interpreted natural harmony to mean minimal preparation of any kind, leading to wedding nights where couples received no guidance whatsoever about physical intimacy, emotional connection, or even basic practical considerations like timing and privacy. This extreme simplification created its own problems, including increased anxiety among young people who felt completely unprepared for marriage, responsibilities, and higher rates of wedding night difficulties that could have been easily prevented. With moderate preparation, new challenges emerged from the vacuum left by the eliminated traditional preparation system. Without structured guidance from harmony teachers and spiritual advisors, Many couples struggled to establish intimate relationships, leading to delayed consummation, communication difficulties, and sometimes years of marital tension that could have been avoided with appropriate education and support. The reform system had successfully eliminated excessive spiritual pressure, but had inadvertently also eliminated practical relationship education that many couples genuinely needed. Second generation effects became apparent as children born too. Reformed marriages began reaching marriageable age in the 740s and 750s. These young people had grown up in families with more relaxed attitudes toward marriage and greater emphasis on individual compatibility, but they also lacked the cultural frameworks for understanding how to balance personal desires with family expectations, individual autonomy with social responsibility, and romantic idealism with practical relationship skills. The most significant long-term development was the emergence of what historians call hybrid wedding culture approaches that attempted to combine the best elements of traditional spiritual preparation with the practical benefits of reformed simplification. Families began developing personalized wedding practices that maintained basic feng shui principles and ancestral acknowledgments while eliminating the most extreme and expensive traditional requirements. This hybrid approach reflected growing sophistication in Tang Dynasty, understanding of the relationship between spiritual, psychological, and practical factors in marriage success. Rather than choosing between elaborate traditional preparation and extreme simplification, many families developed customized approaches that addressed their specific needs, financial capabilities, and spiritual beliefs while avoiding the problems that had plagued both previous systems. Regional variations in how reforms were implemented also became more pronounced during this period. Northern Chinese families tended toward more conservative interpretations of simplified wedding practices, maintaining stronger traditional elements while reducing complexity. Southern families often embraced more radical simplification, sometimes eliminating spiritual elements almost entirely in favor of purely practical relationship preparation. These regional differences created a natural laboratory for testing different approaches to wedding culture reform. The transformation of Tang Dynasty wedding culture created opportunities for entirely new types of professionals and institutions that hadn't existed under the traditional system. Relationship counselors, though they wouldn't have used that modern term, emerged as specialists who helped couples develop ongoing communication and intimacy skills. Rather than focusing on single-event wedding preparation, these practitioners combined elements of traditional harmony, teaching with newer approaches borrowed from Buddhist meditation practices and Confucian moral philosophy. Master Chun, the relationship counselor, became one of the most influential figures in this new professional category. Unlike traditional harmony teachers who focused on optimizing wedding night performance, Master Chun worked with couples throughout their first years of marriage, helping them navigate the practical and emotional challenges of building long-term partnerships. His approach emphasized gradual skill development, mutual understanding, and conflict resolution techniques that helped couples maintain harmony through ordinary daily challenges rather than just achieving cosmic alignment during special occasions. How these new professionals differed from earlier specialists was significant. Traditional feng shui masters and harmony teachers had operated according to predetermined spiritual formulas that were supposed to work for everyone, regardless of individual circumstances. The new relationship counselors emphasized personalized approaches that considered each couple's unique personalities, backgrounds, and goals. This individualized method required more sophisticated understanding of human psychology and more flexible adaptation of techniques to specific situations. Educational institutions also emerged as new players in Tang Dynasty marriage culture. Private academies began offering courses for young people approaching marriageable age, providing practical education about relationship skills, family management, and even basic information about physical intimacy that families were often too embarrassed to discuss directly. These schools filled the educational vacuum created when traditional preparation rituals were simplified, offering structured learning opportunities without the spiritual pressure and cosmic optimization requirements that had characterized older approaches. The Academy of Harmonious Relations, established in Chang'an in 738 CE, became the model for similar institutions throughout the empire. Unlike traditional harmony teachers who worked with individual brides during intensive pre-wedding preparation, the Academy offered ongoing educational programs for both men and women that cover practical relationship skills, household management, child-rearing techniques, and even basic medical knowledge about fertility and health. This educational approach treated marriage as a learnable set of skills rather than an innate spiritual ability that either existed or didn't. Religious communities also evolved new roles in supporting marriage culture. Buddhist temples began offering relationship meditation retreats, where couples could learn spiritual practices designed to enhance mutual understanding and emotional connection. These programs emphasized mindfulness, compassion, and communication skills rather than cosmic optimization and ritual performance. Taoist centers developed similar programs focused on natural harmony and balance in daily life, rather than elaborate ceremony and preparation. Their contributions to the evolving marriage culture were substantial and lasting. The new relationship. Counselors provided ongoing support that helped couples maintain their marriages through normal life challenges rather than just optimizing single events. Educational institutions created systematic knowledge transmission that didn't depend on expensive private consultations or family connections. Religious programs offered spiritual frameworks for marriage that emphasized personal growth and mutual development, rather than external ritual compliance. Specific stories about these new elements reveal how they operated in practice. The case of merchant Liu Guangming and his wife Lady Chen illustrates how the new support systems functioned. After experiencing significant marital difficulties during their first year of marriage despite simplified wedding preparation, they enrolled in Master Chen's relationship counseling program and attended Buddhist meditation retreats together. The combination of practical communication training and spiritual practices designed to enhance mutual understanding helped them develop a genuinely harmonious marriage that lasted for decades and became a model for other couples in their community. But some problems persisted despite the reforms and new support systems that emerged during the later Tang Dynasty period. The fundamental challenge of arranging successful marriages between people who barely knew each other remained largely unresolved. Regardless of whether families used traditional elaborate preparation, simplified approaches, or hybrid methods, the practice of arranged marriage itself created inherent difficulties that no amount of spiritual optimization or practical education could completely overcome, leading to ongoing issues that influenced Chinese marriage culture for centuries. Continuing, challenges included persistent family pressure for rapid production of male heirs, which created psychological stress that undermined the relaxed approach to relationship development that reforms were supposed to encourage. Even simplified wedding practices couldn't eliminate the economic and social pressures that made marriage primarily about family alliance and reproduction rather than individual compatibility and emotional connection. Young couples continued to face expectations that their personal relationships should serve broader family and social purposes that sometimes conflicted with their individual needs and desires. What didn't get resolved was the basic contradiction between individual autonomy and collective family decision-making that characterized Tang Dynasty's social structure. While wedding culture reforms had reduced some of the most extreme manifestations of family control over intimate relationships. They hadn't fundamentally changed the social system that gave extended families primary authority over marriage decisions. Young people gained some additional freedom in how they conducted their relationships, but they still had minimal input into who they married or when. New versions of old problems emerged as the reformed system matured. Competition between families shifted from elaborate wedding preparation to sophisticated relationship education and ongoing support services. Instead of bankrupting themselves on feng shui optimization and cosmic alignment, some families began overspending on relationship counseling, educational programs, and ongoing marital support services. The competitive pressure to provide optimal marriage preparation had been redirected rather than eliminated. Cyclical patterns developed as each generation reacted against the approaches used by their parents. Young people who had grown up with simplified wedding practices sometimes embraced more traditional spiritual elements as a way of asserting their independence from reformed approaches. Others moved toward even greater simplification, rejecting both traditional and hybrid approaches in favor of purely practical arrangements, based entirely on economic and social compatibility. Why certain issues proved intractable relates to their deep connection to fundamental aspects of Tang Dynasty social structure that extended far beyond wedding culture. The patriarchal family system, the importance of male inheritance, the economic functions of marriage alliances, and the spiritual significance of ancestral continuity were too central to Chinese civilization to be significantly modified by changes in wedding preparation practices alone. The persistence of gender inequality in marriage relationships remained largely unchanged despite wedding culture reforms. Women continued to bear primary responsibility for adapting to their husbands' families and preferences, while men retained most of the decision-making authority in marriage relationships. Simplified wedding practices had reduced some of the most extreme demands placed on brides, but hadn't fundamentally altered the power dynamics that characterized Tang Dynasty marriage. Regional and class differences in how ongoing issues were addressed revealed the limitations of imperial reform efforts. Wealthy urban families had access to new relationship support services and educational resources that helped them navigate persistent marriage challenges more effectively than poor rural families who continued to rely on traditional approaches or simplified practices without additional support. These disparities meant that marriage culture reforms benefited some segments of society much more than others. The most significant ongoing issue was the gradual recognition that successful marriage required ongoing effort and skill development. That couldn't be achieved through any single preparation approach, whether traditional or reformed. This realization led to growing emphasis on long-term relationship education and support, but also created new forms of anxiety and pressure as couples worried about whether they were maintaining their marriages according to evolving standards of relationship excellence. Compared to earlier periods in Chinese history, Tang Dynasty wedding culture represented unprecedented sophistication in understanding the psychological and social factors that influenced marriage success, even when this understanding was expressed through spiritual and cosmic terminology. Unlike previous dynasties that had relied primarily on basic arranged marriage practices with minimal preparation or support, Tang families developed complex systems for optimizing relationship outcomes that acknowledged the importance of compatibility, preparation, and ongoing support. What was unique about Tang Dynasty approaches was their integration of spiritual, practical, and psychological elements in comprehensive systems designed to address multiple aspects of marriage relationships simultaneously. Earlier Chinese dynasties had typically focused on political and economic functions of marriage with minimal attention to personal compatibility or intimate relationship quality. Later periods would often separate spiritual, practical, and emotional aspects of marriage into distinct categories rather than attempting integrated approaches. What was universal about Tang Dynasty marriage challenges reflects persistent human needs that transcend specific cultural contexts. The desire for individual autonomy within collective social structures, the challenge of building intimate relationships with arranged partners, and the difficulty of balancing family expectations with personal fulfillment are issues that appear across cultures and historical periods. The Tang Dynasty's specific solutions were culturally particular, but the underlying problems they addressed were fundamentally human. Lessons that could be learned from Tang Dynasty wedding culture include the recognition that elaborate external preparation cannot substitute for genuine compatibility and ongoing relationship skills. That extreme approaches in either traditional or reformed directions often create new problems while solving old ones. And that successful cultural change requires gradual adaptation rather than radical transformation. The Tang experience also demonstrates how economic pressure and social competition can corrupt even well-intentioned cultural practices, turning them into burdens rather than supports for human flourishing. Patterns that repeated elsewhere in Chinese history and in other cultures include the tendency for marriage preparation practices to become increasingly elaborate and expensive over time. The cyclical swing between traditional and reformed approaches as each generation reacts against previous practices, and the persistent challenge of balancing individual desires with family and social expectations. Similar patterns can be observed in other cultures that practice arranged marriage and in societies that place high value on ritual and spiritual preparation for major life transitions. The comparative analysis reveals that Tang Dynasty wedding culture represents a sophisticated but ultimately flawed attempt to engineer optimal human relationships through external manipulation and preparation, an approach that has appeared in various forms across cultures and continues to influence contemporary attitudes toward marriage and relationship preparation. By the late 8th century, signs pointed to fundamental transformation in Tang Dynasty wedding culture that would ultimately end the sophisticated system of marriage preparation and cosmic optimization that had defined Chinese aristocratic society for nearly 2 centuries. The warning signs were everywhere for those who knew how to read them: declining participation in traditional ceremonies, growing skepticism about spiritual efficacy of wedding preparations, and most tellingly, the emergence of entirely new approaches to marriage that bypassed established cultural frameworks altogether. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals the complex dynamics of cultural transformation that were reshaping Tang Dynasty society during this period. Imperial court officials recognized that political instability following the Anlushan rebellion of 755 CE had disrupted many traditional cultural practices, but they underestimated how profoundly warfare and social upheaval had changed young people's attitudes toward marriage and family traditions. Military commanders understood that prolonged conflict had created a generation of pragmatic survivors who prioritized practical outcomes over spiritual perfection, but they failed to anticipate how this pragmatism would reshape intimate relationships and wedding culture. Wedding culture specialists like feng shui masters and relationship counselors could observe declining demand for their services, but many misinterpreted this trend as temporary economic hardship rather than fundamental cultural shift. They continued developing increasingly sophisticated techniques for optimizing marriage relationships, apparently unaware that their target audience was losing interest in optimization approaches altogether in favor of more spontaneous and individually determined relationship patterns. Resistance to inevitable change came primarily from wealthy families who had invested decades in mastering refined wedding culture practices and viewed their expertise as essential markers of social status and cultural sophistication. These conservative families continued hosting elaborate weddings and maintaining traditional preparation requirements even as broader society moved towards simpler approaches, creating an increasingly isolated subculture of traditional practice that had diminishing influence on general social patterns. The most significant warning sign was the growing popularity of love marriages, relationships that developed through personal choice and extended courtship rather than family arrangement, and spiritual optimization. These unions, while still requiring family approval and basic social recognition, represented a fundamental departure from centuries of Chinese marriage culture that had emphasized cosmic harmony and family alliance over individual affection and personal compatibility. Young people were increasingly willing to delay marriage for years while they searched for personally compatible partners, a behavior pattern that would have been considered spiritually dangerous and socially irresponsible by previous generations. This willingness to prioritize individual preference over family timing preferences indicated a profound shift in values that challenged basic assumptions about the relationship between personal desires and social obligations. Economic factors also contributed to the warning signs of cultural transformation. The enormous costs of maintaining sophisticated wedding preparation systems became increasingly difficult to justify during periods of political instability and military expense. Families that had previously competed to provide the most elaborate spiritual optimization for their children began questioning whether these investments actually produced better outcomes than simpler approaches that cost a fraction of traditional amounts. Religious communities provided mixed signals about impending cultural change. Buddhist temples reported increasing interest in meditation and spiritual development programs for married couples, suggesting continued demand for spiritual approaches to relationship enhancement. However, the specific requests were shifting away from cosmic optimization and ritual performance toward personal growth and emotional development, indicating fundamental changes in how people understood the relationship between spirituality and marriage. The Tang Dynasty's sophisticated wedding culture system didn't collapse suddenly. It gradually faded away. During the decades of political fragmentation and social upheaval that characterized the dynasty's final century, the formal end came not through imperial decree or religious prohibition, but through the quiet abandonment of traditional practices by families who could no longer afford elaborate preparations and young people who no longer believed in their efficacy. The specific events that marked the system's demise were surprisingly mundane rather than dramatically symbolic. The last recorded imperial wedding conducted according to full traditional cosmic optimization protocols occurred in 846 CE, during Emperor Wuzong's reign. But even this ceremony was notably simplified compared to the elaborate preparations that had characterized imperial marriages during the early Tang period. By the 880s, court records show that even aristocratic families were conducting weddings with basic spiritual acknowledgments, but without the complex feng shui calculations, extensive preparation periods, and specialized professional consultations that had once been considered essential. Final major players in the dying system included Master Li Weiming, the last officially recognized imperial feng shui specialist, whose detailed records of wedding optimization techniques were preserved in the imperial archives, but apparently consulted by no one after his death in 867 CE. Madame Song, representing the final generation of traditional harmony teachers, adapted her services toward general relationship counseling for established couples rather than pre-wedding preparation, effectively acknowledging that the market for traditional wedding optimization had disappeared. The last attempts to preserve or revive traditional wedding culture came from scholarly families who tried to maintain classical practices as expressions of cultural refinement and historical continuity rather than practical preparation for marriage. These efforts created a kind of museum version of Tang wedding culture that preserved the forms but lacked the social meaning and practical function that had originally given these practices their power and relevance. Dramatic final moments were few, but one particularly poignant example comes from the wedding of Li Jingshuan, descendant of a prominent Chang'an family. In 881 CE, his family had spent enormous resources attempting to recreate the elaborate wedding preparations that had characterized their ancestors' marriages, hiring specialists who had trained under traditional masters and following classical protocols that had been carefully preserved in family archives. However, the bride, influenced by the more practical attitudes of her generation, publicly questioned the value of these preparations during the ceremony itself, asking why cosmic forces would care more about room arrangement than genuine mutual respect and affection. This incident, recorded by a family chronicler who seemed more amused than scandalized, illustrates how changed social attitudes had made traditional wedding culture seem not just expensive or difficult, but fundamentally absurd to younger generations. The elaborate spiritual preparations that had once seemed essential for cosmic harmony now appeared to many people as empty rituals that distracted from rather than enhanced genuine human connection. The gradual decline, rather than sudden collapse, meant that different elements of traditional wedding culture disappeared at different rates and in different regions. Urban areas abandoned complex feng shui optimization and professional spiritual consultations earlier than rural regions, where traditional practices persisted longer due to stronger family authority and less exposure to alternative approaches. Wealthy families maintained simplified versions of traditional ceremonies, longer than middle-class families who quickly adopted pragmatic approaches that emphasized practical preparation over spiritual optimization. Regional variations in the ending process reveal how cultural transformation occurs unevenly across geographic and social boundaries. Northern China, with stronger traditional Confucian influence, maintained basic spiritual elements of wedding culture longer than southern regions where Buddhist and Taoist alternatives had greater influence. Military frontier areas, where practical considerations had always taken precedence over elaborate ceremony, transitioned to simplified wedding practices earlier and more completely than stable agricultural regions where traditional family structures remained stronger. The symbolic end points varied depending on perspective and definition. From an institutional standpoint, the system ended when imperial support for traditional wedding culture specialists was withdrawn during the late 9th century budget crisis. From a social perspective, it ended when the majority of families no longer felt obligated to justify simplified wedding practices to their extended relatives and community members. From a cultural standpoint, it ended when knowledge of traditional optimization techniques ceased being transmitted from one generation to the next, breaking the chain of cultural continuity that had sustained these practices for centuries. Collapse of Tang Dynasty wedding culture resulted from a complex combination of internal contradictions, external pressures, and fundamental changes in Chinese society that made traditional approaches to marriage preparation increasingly irrelevant to people's actual needs and circumstances. Analysis of the causes reveals how cultural practices that seem stable and permanent can become suddenly obsolete when the social conditions that supported them change. Internal problems within the wedding culture system itself contributed significantly to its eventual abandonment. The escalating complexity and expense of traditional preparation had created an arms race of spiritual sophistication that many families could no longer afford, and young people could no longer psychologically tolerate. The gap between promised outcomes and actual results had become so obvious that even conservative families began questioning whether elaborate preparations actually produced better marriages than simpler approaches. The fundamental contradiction between engineered spiritual perfection and authentic human connection had never been resolved, only temporarily managed through various reforms and adaptations. By the late Tang period, this contradiction had become untenable as young people who had greater individual autonomy and exposure to alternative cultural models refused to accept that cosmic forces required them to subordinate their personal preferences to elaborate ritual requirements. External pressures from political instability, military conflict, and economic hardship made the luxury of elaborate wedding preparation seem not just expensive, but morally questionable during periods when basic survival was challenging for many families. The Lushan rebellion and subsequent political fragmentation had created a social environment where practical skills and adaptability were more valued than cultural refinement and spiritual sophistication. Changes in religious and philosophical thinking also undermined traditional wedding culture assumptions. Buddhism's growing emphasis on individual spiritual development conflicted with systems that treated marriage primarily as family and cosmic events rather than personal spiritual journeys. Neo-Confucian thinking that would dominate later Chinese culture was already beginning to question whether elaborate ritual could substitute for genuine moral development and practical wisdom. The role of individuals versus historical forces in causing this transformation illustrates how cultural change results from complex interactions between personal choices and broader social trends. Individual families who chose practical approaches over traditional preparation created models that other families could follow. That these individual choices were enabled by larger changes in economic conditions, social values, and political stability that made alternatives possible and attractive. What could have been done differently to preserve valuable elements of traditional wedding culture while addressing its obvious problems remains a subject of historical speculation. Some scholars argue that gradual reform rather than abandonment might have preserved beneficial aspects of spiritual preparation and family support while eliminating the most problematic elements of cosmic optimization and competitive excess. The question of inevitability versus contingency in cultural transformation reveals how historical outcomes that seem predetermined in retrospect often depended on specific decisions and circumstances that could have developed differently. If Tang Dynasty political stability had been maintained, if economic prosperity had continued, if religious and philosophical alternatives hadn't gained influence, traditional wedding culture might have evolved rather than disappeared. However, the deeper analysis suggests that the contradictions within Tang Dynasty wedding culture was so fundamental that some form of major transformation was probably inevitable. The system's core assumptions about the relationship between spiritual preparation and human compatibility, individual autonomy and family authority, cultural tradition and practical effectiveness had become increasingly untenable as Chinese society developed greater sophistication in understanding human psychology and social relationships. The most balanced assessment recognizes that Tang Dynasty wedding culture ended because it had served its historical purpose but was no longer adapted to changing social conditions. Like many cultural practices, it had evolved to address specific historical needs and circumstances, but became obsolete when those conditions changed and new approaches better served people's actual requirements for successful marriage relationships. The immediate aftermath of Tang Dynasty wedding culture's demise was a period of social experimentation and uncertainty as Chinese families struggled to develop new approaches to marriage preparation without the elaborate frameworks that had guided their ancestors for centuries. Who stepped into the vacuum left by the collapsed traditional system were primarily pragmatic family matriarchs and community elders who emphasized practical relationship skills and basic social protocols over cosmic optimization and spiritual preparation. Short-term consequences included both liberation and anxiety. as young people gained unprecedented freedom to shape their own wedding experiences, but lost the structured guidance that traditional preparation had provided. However, imperfectly. Many couples reported feeling simultaneously relieved to escape the pressure of elaborate spiritual requirements and worried about whether they were adequately prepared for marriage without professional guidance and cosmic optimization. Contemporary reactions vary dramatically across different segments of Chinese society. Educated urban families generally welcomed the simplification and cost reduction that came with abandoning traditional wedding culture, viewing it as progress toward more rational and practical approaches to marriage. Rural families and conservative aristocrats often mourned the loss of cultural sophistication and spiritual depth that they associated with traditional practices, though many privately admitted that simplified approaches produced equally successful marriages at much lower cost. The most significant immediate legacy was the establishment of marriage as primarily a personal and family matter rather than a cosmic and social event requiring professional spiritual intervention. This shift had profound implications for Chinese culture that extended far beyond wedding practices, contributing to growing emphasis on individual responsibility and practical problem-solving in many areas of life. Attempts at revival or continuation were sporadic and generally unsuccessful. Some scholarly families tried to maintain traditional knowledge as cultural heritage, creating detailed written records of feng shui principles and spiritual preparation techniques. However, these preservation efforts were primarily historical and academic rather than practical, as few people were interested in actually applying traditional methods to contemporary marriage preparation. Religious communities made various attempts to provide spiritual frameworks for simplified wedding practices, but these efforts typically emphasized personal spiritual development and ongoing relationship growth rather than attempting to recreate the elaborate cosmic optimization systems that had characterized classical Tang Dynasty wedding culture. The result was a more personalized and flexible approach to spirituality and marriage that influenced Chinese religious practice for centuries. The immediate aftermath established patterns of pragmatic individualism in marriage culture that would characterize Chinese society through subsequent dynastic periods, representing a permanent shift away from elaborate, collective spiritual preparation toward more private and personally determined approaches to intimate relationships. The legacy of Tang Dynasty wedding culture shaped Chinese marriage practices for over a millennium after the elaborate cosmic optimization systems had been abandoned, influencing how later generations understood the relationship between spiritual preparation, family authority, and individual autonomy in intimate relationships. Specific influences can be traced through subsequent dynastic periods, where simplified versions of Tang wedding principles continued to guide family practices, even when the complex feng shui calculations and harmony teacher consultations had been forgotten. Song Dynasty marriage culture retained the Tang emphasis on cosmic timing and basic spiritual preparation, while rejecting the elaborate professional consultation systems that had characterized earlier periods. Song families continued to consult almanacs for auspicious wedding dates and maintained simplified feng shui principles in bridal chamber arrangement, but they focused primarily on practical preparation and family harmony rather than complex cosmic optimization. This selective preservation of Tang elements created a more sustainable approach to spiritual wedding preparation that influenced Chinese culture for centuries. How later generations viewed Tang Dynasty wedding practices reveals the complex process by which cultural memory transforms historical reality into mythological ideals. Ming and Qing Dynasty writers often romanticize Tang wedding culture as representing a golden age of spiritual sophistication and family harmony, conveniently forgetting the psychological pressure, financial burden, and frequent failures that had characterized the actual historical system. These romanticized memories influenced later attempts to revive traditional wedding practices, but typically emphasized aesthetic and ceremonial elements, rather than the underlying spiritual beliefs that had originally motivated Tang Dynasty. Preparations, the myths versus realities that developed around Tang Dynasty wedding culture show how historical practices become distorted through cultural transmission and selective memory. Popular literature and family traditions preserve stories about elaborate bridal chamber preparations, cosmic harmony optimization, and perfect romantic outcomes while forgetting the anxiety, expense, and frequent disappointment that had actually characterized many Tang Dynasty weddings. These mythologized versions of Tang wedding culture influenced later generations' expectations about marriage preparation without providing realistic models for achieving successful relationships. Why Tang Dynasty wedding practices remained important or were forgotten depended largely on their practical utility and social relevance to later historical periods. Elements that addressed genuine human needs: basic spiritual acknowledgement, family blessing, preparation for intimate relationships, were preserved and adapted across dynastic changes. Aspects that reflected specifically Tang Dynasty social conditions: elaborate cosmic optimization, professional spiritual consultation, competitive family preparation, were gradually abandoned as social conditions changed and their practical benefits became questionable. The most lasting impact was the establishment of marriage as simultaneously a personal relationship and a family event that required both individual preparation and collective support. This balance between personal autonomy and family involvement, first articulated during Tang Dynasty wedding culture reforms, became a defining characteristic of Chinese marriage practices that persisted through major political and social transformations. Later dynasties modified the specific methods for achieving this balance, but they maintained the basic principle that successful marriages require both individual compatibility and family harmony. Tang Dynasty innovations in relationship counseling and ongoing marriage support also influenced later Chinese culture in ways that extended far beyond wedding practices. The recognition that successful relationships required learnable skills, ongoing effort, and community support became embedded in Chinese approaches to family life, child-rearing, and social organization. This understanding contributed to the development of extended family support systems and community networks that helped couples maintain their marriages through normal life challenges. The Tang legacy also included a permanent skepticism about purely external approaches to relationship optimization that influenced Chinese attitudes toward marriage preparation for centuries. While later dynasties continued to emphasize the importance of proper preparation and spiritual blessing for weddings, they generally avoided the extreme approaches that had characterized peak Tang Dynasty wedding culture. This learned caution about spiritual excess became part of Chinese cultural wisdom about marriage that was transmitted through family traditions and popular literature. Regional variations in how Tang Dynasty wedding culture was remembered and adapted reveal the complex ways that cultural legacy operates across different geographic and social contexts. Northern China maintained stronger emphasis on ceremonial and spiritual elements derived from Tang traditions, while southern regions focused more on practical relationship preparation and family harmony aspects of the Tang legacy. Today, we can see remarkable echoes of Tang Dynasty wedding culture in contemporary Chinese wedding practices and, perhaps more surprisingly, in global wedding culture that has developed similar patterns of elaborate preparation, professional consultation, and spiritual optimization despite completely different cultural origins. The parallels reveal persistent human tendencies toward ritual complexity, competitive display, and the search for external solutions to relationship challenges that transcend specific historical and cultural contexts. Modern Chinese weddings, particularly among wealthy urban families, often reproduce Tang Dynasty patterns of escalating preparation complexity and professional specialization, without conscious awareness of the historical precedents. Contemporary Chinese couples hire wedding planners, feng shui consultants, and relationship coaches in ways that directly parallel Tang Dynasty harmony teachers and cosmic optimization specialists. The specific techniques and terminology have changed, but the underlying assumption that professional expertise can optimize romantic outcomes remains remarkably consistent across more than a millennium of cultural development. The modern Chinese wedding industry's emphasis on auspicious timing, optimal venue design, and elaborate preparation rituals reflects direct continuity with Tang Dynasty wedding culture principles, though contemporary practitioners rarely acknowledge this historical connection. Modern feng shui consultation for wedding venues operates according to the same basic assumptions about environmental influence on relationship outcomes that motivated Tang Dynasty bridal chamber design. While contemporary relationship coaching often employs psychological terminology to provide advice that is functionally identical to what Tang Dynasty harmony teachers offered using spiritual language, specific parallels in contemporary wedding culture include the phenomenon of wedding preparation stress, where couples become so focused on optimizing every detail of their wedding experience that they lose sight of the actual relationship development that should be their primary concern. This modern problem directly mirrors the Tang Dynasty pattern, where elaborate spiritual preparation often interfered with genuine emotional connection between arranged marriage partners. The contemporary wedding industrial complex that has developed in many cultures reproduces Tang Dynasty patterns of professional specialization, competitive family spending, and escalating complexity that can overwhelm the couple supposedly being served. Modern wedding planners, photographers, florists, and other specialists often promote increasingly elaborate approaches that parallel Tang Dynasty. Feng shui masters and harmony teachers in their claims about optimizing romantic outcomes through external manipulation and professional expertise. What hasn't changed about human nature becomes apparent when comparing Tang Dynasty and modern approaches to wedding anxiety, family pressure, and social performance. Contemporary couples facing elaborate wedding preparations report the same psychological stress, financial pressure, and concern about performing according to predetermined expectations that characterize Tang Dynasty wedding culture. The specific cultural contexts are completely different, but the underlying human responses to ritualized relationship preparation remain remarkably consistent. Similar patterns in different cultural contexts can be observed in contemporary Indian wedding culture, where elaborate preparation systems, family competition, and spiritual optimization approaches reproduce Tang Dynasty dynamics using completely different religious and cultural frameworks. The Hindu tradition of extensive wedding preparation, cosmic timing calculations, and family investment in spiritual optimization for romantic success operates according to principles that would be immediately recognizable to Tang Dynasty wedding culture. Specialist. American and European wedding culture has independently developed its own versions of preparation excess, professional consultation systems, and spiritual optimization approaches that parallel Tang Dynasty patterns despite having no historical connection to Chinese traditions. The contemporary phenomenon of bridezilla behavior, wedding preparation stress, and family competition over wedding elaborateness reflects the same human tendencies that created problems in Tang Dynasty wedding culture over 1,000 years ago. Lessons for contemporary issues emerge from recognizing these parallels between Tang Dynasty and modern wedding culture. The Tang Dynasty experience suggests that elaborate external preparation cannot substitute for genuine compatibility and ongoing relationship skills. That competitive family spending on wedding optimization often creates more problems than it solves. and that the most successful marriages typically result from focusing on practical relationship development rather than perfect ceremonial execution. The parallel between Tang Dynasty harmony teachers and modern relationship coaches reveals both the persistence of human needs for relationship guidance and the tendency to package practical psychology using whatever spiritual or scientific terminology is culturally acceptable. Contemporary couples seeking relationship advice often receive fundamentally similar guidance to what Tang Dynasty harmony teachers provided, though modern practitioners use psychological research and therapeutic techniques rather than cosmic harmony theories to explain their recommendations. Modern dating apps and matchmaking services reproduce Tang Dynasty Master Wang's approach of using systematic analysis to identify compatible partners, though contemporary systems rely on algorithms and personality assessments rather than astrological calculations and social observation. The underlying recognition that successful relationships require more than random chance remains consistent across these vastly different technological and cultural contexts. Even now, Tang Dynasty wedding culture continues to influence modern Chinese society and global wedding practices in ways that are often invisible to contemporary participants, but reveal the persistent power of cultural patterns established over a millennium ago. Academic study of Tang Dynasty marriage practices has intensified in recent decades as scholars recognize their relevance to understanding contemporary relationship challenges and wedding culture dynamics that appear across different societies. Modern Chinese wedding practices retain numerous elements directly descended from Tang Dynasty innovations, though they are often disguised by contemporary terminology and updated spiritual frameworks. The emphasis on auspicious timing, optimal environmental design, and family blessing that characterizes modern Chinese weddings reflects continuous transmission of Tang Dynasty principles through family traditions and cultural practices that have survived multiple dynastic changes and political transformations. Popular culture representations of Chinese wedding traditions frequently draw inspiration from Tang Dynasty sources, though they typically romanticize the historical reality and emphasize aesthetic rather than spiritual elements. Contemporary Chinese films, television dramas, and literature often portray elaborate wedding preparations and spiritual optimization approaches that reference Tang Dynasty practices while adapting them to modern sensibilities and technological possibilities. Political discourse about marriage and family values in contemporary China sometimes explicitly references Tang Dynasty wedding culture as representing traditional Chinese approaches to marriage preparation and family harmony. However, these political references typically emphasize selective aspects of Tang Dynasty practices while ignoring the historical problems and contradictions that led to their eventual abandonment. Social movements promoting traditional Chinese culture have attempted to revive Tang Dynasty wedding practices as alternatives to Western-influenced modern wedding culture, but these revival efforts usually focus on ceremonial and aesthetic elements rather than the underlying spiritual beliefs and social systems that originally motivated Tang Dynasty wedding preparation. The result is often a kind of cultural performance that reproduces the appearance of traditional practices without their original meaning or function. The most significant continuing influence operates through unconscious cultural transmission of assumptions about the relationship between external preparation and relationship success that originated in Tang Dynasty wedding culture. Contemporary Chinese families often invest heavily in wedding preparation and spiritual optimization without realizing that their approaches reproduce patterns established during the Tang Dynasty, modified by subsequent historical developments. But maintaining the same basic logic about optimizing romantic outcomes through environmental manipulation and professional consultation. International influence of Tang Dynasty. Wedding culture principles can be observed in the global spread of feng shui consultation for wedding venues, the adoption of Chinese astrological elements in wedding planning across different cultures, and the growing international market for relationship coaching and marriage preparation services that operate according to principles that would be familiar to Tang Dynasty harmony teachers. Academic research continues to reveal new aspects of Tang Dynasty wedding culture influence on later Chinese history and contemporary global wedding practices. Archaeological discoveries, textual analysis, and comparative cultural studies provide ongoing insights into how Tang Dynasty innovations in marriage, preparation, and relationship support influenced the development of Chinese civilization and contributed to patterns that appear across different cultures and historical periods. Why people still care about Tang Dynasty wedding culture relates to its relevance for understanding persistent human challenges in balancing individual autonomy with family expectations, managing the relationship between spiritual preparation and practical relationship skills, and navigating the tensions between traditional cultural practices and contemporary social conditions. Looking back across 3 centuries of Tang Dynasty wedding culture, we've seen a remarkable human story unfold, one that reveals how societies create elaborate systems to manage their deepest anxieties about love, compatibility, and cosmic harmony, only to discover that the most sophisticated preparations often can't guarantee the simple human connections that actually make relationships work. The major themes that emerge from our exploration show patterns that feel surprisingly familiar to anyone who has witnessed modern wedding culture. From the escalating expense and competitive preparation to the gap between romantic idealism and practical reality, key patterns we discovered include the persistent tendency for marriage preparation systems to become increasingly complex over time, driven by family competition and professional specialization that often loses sight of the couple supposedly being served. The Tang Dynasty progression from basic spiritual acknowledgement to elaborate cosmic optimization to eventual simplification and abandonment illustrates how cultural practices can evolve beyond their useful limits and create the very problems they were designed to solve. The most surprising discoveries challenged many assumptions about both historical Chinese culture and human nature itself. Rather than finding a society of passive acceptance and rigid tradition, we encountered young people like Princess Gaoyang, turning their wedding nights into philosophical debates, and Crown Prince Li Chongrun throwing silk pillows at his cosmically optimized bride, while arguing about poetry criticism. These stories revealed that the fundamental human struggles with arranged marriage, family expectations, and the search for authentic connection transcend specific cultural contexts and historical periods. The most important takeaways center on the recognition that successful relationships require ongoing practical skills and genuine compatibility rather than perfect external preparation. That elaborate spiritual optimization systems often create more psychological pressure than spiritual benefit, and that the most meaningful traditions are those that adapt to serve human needs, rather than demanding that humans serve traditional requirements. How our understanding evolved throughout this journey reflects the complexity of cultural analysis itself. What initially appeared to be a story about exotic historical practices gradually revealed itself to be fundamentally about universal human experiences, the desire for love and acceptance, the pressure to perform according to social expectations, and the challenge of balancing individual autonomy with collective responsibilities. The Tang Dynasty wedding culture, that seemed so foreign at first, became increasingly recognizable as we explored its psychological and social dynamics. The historical progression from elaborate, traditional preparation through imperial reforms to eventual abandonment and modern parallels illustrates how societies continuously negotiate between inherited wisdom and contemporary needs. The Tang Dynasty experience suggests that the most sustainable cultural practices are those that preserve essential values while remaining flexible, enough to adapt their methods as social conditions change. Perhaps most significantly, our exploration revealed how the gap between cultural ideals and lived reality often drives historical change. Tang Dynasty wedding culture collapsed not because people rejected its values, family harmony, spiritual blessing, successful relationships, but because its methods had become counterproductive to achieving those very goals. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout history and remains relevant to understanding contemporary cultural conflicts and social transformations. The journey also highlighted the importance of individual agency within collective cultural systems, showing how people like Master Wang, the pragmatic matchmaker, and Madame Liu, the practical harmony teacher, found ways to serve human needs, while working within official frameworks that emphasized cosmic forces over psychological reality. One final, compelling anecdote perfectly encapsulates the broader themes we've explored and provides a memorable image of how Tang Dynasty wedding culture both succeeded and failed in its fundamental mission. In 756 CE, during the chaos following the An Lashen rebellion, a young couple named Chen Mingshan and Lady Wu found themselves married under circumstances that violated virtually every principle of proper Tang Dynasty wedding preparation, while somehow achieving the cosmic harmony that elaborate traditional methods had promised but rarely delivered. Chen Mingshan was a minor military officer whose family had been scattered by the rebellion, while Lady Wu was a merchant's daughter whose family had lost their fortune when their silk warehouses were destroyed during the siege of Chang'an. Their marriage was arranged hastily by surviving relatives who had neither time nor resources for proper spiritual preparation, feng shui consultation, or harmony teacher guidance. The wedding ceremony was conducted in a Buddhist temple that was serving as a refugee shelter, with their bridal chamber being a corner of the temple courtyard, separated from other displaced families by hanging silk curtains. What makes their story remarkable is how it reveals the essence of what Tang Dynasty wedding culture had been trying to achieve through all its elaborate methods. Without any cosmic optimization, astrological calculations, or professional spiritual consultation, Chen Mingshan and Lady Wu spent their wedding night sharing stories about their families, discussing their hopes for survival and eventual prosperity, and gradually discovering a genuine emotional connection based on mutual respect, shared circumstances, and compatible personalities. Their wedding night, conducted with nothing but basic human courtesy and a handful of temple incense sticks for spiritual blessing, achieved the authentic intimacy and cosmic harmony that families had spent fortunes trying to engineer through elaborate preparation systems. The couple reported in later family records that they felt genuinely blessed by ancestral spirits and cosmic forces, not because of perfect environmental design or optimal spiritual preparation, but because their relationship was built on practical partnership and emotional honesty. Why this story encapsulates the broader themes we've explored becomes clear when we consider how Chen Mingshan and Lady Wu's experience illustrates both the genuine value and the fundamental limitations of Tang Dynasty wedding culture. Their success demonstrates that the goals of traditional wedding preparation, spiritual blessing, family harmony, intimate connection, were achievable and meaningful. However, their achievement of these goals through simplified means reveals how the elaborate methods that Tang Dynasty families had developed often interfered with rather than enhanced the authentic spiritual and emotional experiences they were designed to create. What their story reveals about everything we've discussed is that human connection operates according to psychological and spiritual principles that can't be optimized through external manipulation, no matter how sophisticated or expensive. The cosmic harmony that Tang Dynasty wedding culture sought was real and attainable, but it emerged from genuine compatibility, mutual respect, and shared experience rather than from perfect feng shui calculations or elaborate spiritual preparation. How their experience connects to our broader exploration shows that the most successful elements of Tang Dynasty wedding culture were those that supported authentic human connection rather than trying to engineer it. Basic spiritual acknowledgement, family blessing, and practical preparation for partnership contributed to successful marriages, while elaborate cosmic optimization and competitive preparation often created barriers to the very outcomes they promised. To guarantee, the memorable final image from Chen Mingshan and Lady Wu's story that stays with us is of two young people sitting at a temple courtyard, surrounded by the chaos of war and social upheaval, discovering genuine love and spiritual connection through simple conversation and mutual consideration. This image captures both the essential humanity that underlies all cultural practices and the recognition that authentic relationships flourish when they're supported rather than controlled by social institutions and spiritual traditions. As we reach the end of our journey through the intimate chambers and elaborate preparations of Tang Dynasty wedding culture, there's something both timeless and deeply human about the stories we've encountered together. From Princess Gaoyang's chess-playing rebellion to Crown Prince Li Chongrun's poetry arguments, from Master Wang's pragmatic matchmaking to Lady Wei's pearl-infused purification rituals, these tales remind us that people in every era struggle with the same fundamental questions about love, family expectations, and the search for authentic connection. The gentle conclusion we can draw from our exploration is that the Tang Dynasty's elaborate wedding culture, for all its spiritual sophistication and cosmic complexity, was ultimately about the same desires that motivate modern couples: the hope for understanding, the need for blessing and support, and the wish to begin married life with both practical preparation and spiritual grace. The specific methods may seem exotic to contemporary eyes, but the underlying human needs they addressed remain remarkably constant across centuries and cultures. Appreciation for the journey we've taken together includes recognition of how these historical stories illuminate contemporary relationship challenges, while providing perspective on the eternal human comedy of trying to optimize romance through external preparation. The Tang Dynasty couples who struggled with feng shui pressure and harmony teacher coaching faced fundamentally similar challenges to modern couples navigating wedding planning stress and family expectations, though their cultural contexts were completely different. The invitation to reflection that emerges from these stories encourages us to consider how our own cultural approaches to marriage preparation and relationship optimization might appear to future historians. Are we creating sustainable traditions that support authentic human connection, or are we developing elaborate systems that serve professional interests and family competition more than the couples they claim to help? The peaceful closing thought that stays with us comes from Chen Mingshan and Lady Wu's simple temple courtyard wedding: the recognition that authentic love and spiritual harmony emerge from genuine human connection rather than perfect external preparation. Their story suggests that while cultural traditions and spiritual practices can support and enhance relationships, they work best when they remain servants rather than masters of the human heart. In the end, the Tang Dynasty's centuries-long experiment with wedding culture optimization teaches us that the most profound spiritual experiences often occur in the simplest moments, when people treat each other with kindness, honesty, and mutual respect. That wisdom feels irrelevant today as it was over 1,000 years ago in the candlelit chambers of medieval Chang'an, where young couples discovered that cosmic harmony was less about perfect preparation and more about perfect presence with each other.